This is a story about friends. In my church women's group, we have assigned friends. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but it isn't really, because women have always had friends. Friends have always been particularly important to women. You like to have someone who is nearby that knows you really well, that you can say anything to, someone who will celebrate with you when there's something to be celebrated, somebody who will sympathize with you when things go wrong. And most people tend to have those friends. And yet, we all know that there's an awful lot of loneliness in the world. And that's where the assigned friends come in. The leaders in our group make sure that every woman in the group has some contact every month with one or two other women in the group. It's really nice. And most of the time, the person who's assigned to you is someone who probably is a lot like you, shares some of your concerns, and is maybe in your stage in life. And so young mothers with toddlers will get together for a play date at the park, or widows can commiserate about the challenges and the decisions that are facing them. So a lot of times the friends are somebody who's a lot like you, but not always. No, really not always. And one year my assigned friend was Gladys. She was not like me. I was in my 30s then with 5 small children, and she was at least 2 decades older than I was. She was very petite. She had bleached blonde hair, and she always had very, very bright red lipstick. She dressed in a very flamboyant style, which made perfect sense because she was Cuban. And so she was a character. And Gladys loved parties. She loved going to them, and she loved planning them too. So if somebody said to her, "Oh, Gladys, we need a 30-foot long replica of a cruise ship for the background for a party," she would say, "No problem." And she would make it happen. Or if somebody said, "Oh, we've got a beach theme going on, can you get us some life-size palm trees?" She would say, "Oh, no problem." And she would get some cardboard tubes and with some wire and some crepe paper. She always bought her crepe paper in Tijuana because she said it was much better quality than the stuff that they sold here. But you'd have your 10-foot tall palm trees. Well, as I said, we weren't very much alike. I was not into doing things like that at all. But my son Robert, that year, he was a senior in high school, and he had homecoming dance coming up. He had asked a young woman to go with him, and she'd agreed, and so he was planning that. And really there were a whole bunch of friends that were planning on going together. And all the guys, in talking, they'd said that they thought it was crazy to rent tuxedos, so expensive and really unnecessary. And so they all decided that they would go to the homecoming dance in dark suits, which made perfect sense. Except that Robert didn't have a dark suit. But there were some things coming up that he probably would need one, and so I was okay with that. Well, early in the week of homecoming, Robert and I went down to Macy's. They were having a sale. We found a suit, fit really well, looked good on him, and not too expensive. Perfect. I was paying for it, though. The salesperson said, "Well, with a suit like this, the pants don't come pre-hemmed, but for a little extra money, you can have one of our tailors hem them for you, and you can pick it up sometime next week." Well, Robert and I looked at each other. No, next week was not going to work. The dance was on Saturday. This was Tuesday. Robert looked at me and he said, "Well, you can hem the pants, right, Mom?" I said, "Sure, no problem." And I could hem pants. I mean, I'd done that before. I knew how to sew, sort of, because back in my day, when you were in junior high, every girl was required to take a semester of sewing and a semester of cooking, just like every boy was required to take a semester of wood shop and a semester of metal shop. So I knew how to sew. My parents had bought me a sewing machine, a little sewing machine, very industrial looking, and it could sew just fine. It sewed forward, backward, nothing fancy like zigzag, mind you. But I'd sewed a gym bag, and I sewed a skirt, and I'd hemmed things before, so that was no problem. But the week was busy, and finally, around Thursday or so, I said, Robert, just get a pair of pants that's the right length and put it on the ironing board, and I'll use those to measure, and then I'll hem them." He said, "Sure." Well, I told you the week was busy. So Saturday afternoon, I thought, okay, it's now or never. I got to hem those pants. So I went over to the ironing board, and there were the new pants from the suit, and there was another pair of pants, and I stretched out the other pair of pants that was on the ironing board, and I took my scissors, and I cut off the excess fabric. I don't know why there's so much fabric on those suit pants. I think they're expecting 7-foot-tall people. It was quite a bit of fabric, but I cut it off. And you know, one thing about sewing is once you've cut fabric, well, there's no going back there, is there? So I cut off both legs, and then I held up the pants, and I thought, wow, that looks kind of short. So I called Robert in, and he tried on the pants. He said, Mom! Yeah, they were too short. I hadn't even turned up the fabric for the hem, and they were already too short. I thought, oh no, the dance is in 2 hours. I have just ruined this suit, and I must have screamed or something because my husband came in and he said, what's wrong? And I said, well, look at this. I've just ruined this whole suit. And he said, can't you just glue the fabric back on? I looked at him. I said, no, you can't just glue the fabric back on. Once you cut it off, there's no going back. It's a done deal. He said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to call Gladys. And he said, Gladys, what's she going to do? What he didn't know, though, but what I knew, was sure, I'd had a semester of sewing in junior high. But Gladys, from Cuba, sewing was her life. She could design things. She could make things that she'd seen, make them up just out of nothing. She could embroider. And I was pretty sure she could hem, too. And I was pretty sure that she had probably some magic in that thimble and needle and thread. So I called her up. I said, Gladys, it's an emergency. And she said, oh, what is it, sweetie? Are you hurt? I said, no. She said, well, are you sick? I said, no. She said, well, what kind of an emergency is it? I said, it's a sewing emergency, Gladys. And she said, oh, sweetie, come right over. And so I did. I took the pants that I'd cut off too short. I took the excess fabric. I took the pants that were the right length. And I said, oh, Gladys, is there anything you can do? And she said, you come back half an hour. No problem. I went home. My husband said, well, I said, I come back half hour. No problem. I went back in a half an hour, and she had worked some magic. She'd folded things and sewn them, and well, the pants were exactly the right length with a nice little cuff on them. So Robert put on those pants. He took the corsage out of the refrigerator. He picked up the car keys, and he was off to the homecoming dance. And I collapsed in the nearest chair, feeling really so grateful, like I had avoided certain disaster. And I realized at that point a couple of things. Number one, it really is true. I reminded myself, once you start cutting fabric, there's no going back on that. And I also realized at that moment that it's nice to have an assigned friend, especially one who's not a thing like you. That's my story.